East amid the Israel-Hamas war. Will his itinerary, however, include Turkey? Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has praised Hamas as quote-unquote a liberating group and has condemned Israel, a position that clashes directly with Washington's view. WION's senior diplomatic correspondent Cindy Sain reports.
As the war between Israel and the militant group Hamas continues, Secretary of State Antony Blinken is heading back to Israel on Friday, after 2 stops there just days after the October 7th massacre of Israeli civilians by the militant group Hamas. At the State Department Wednesday, Deputy spokesperson Matthew Miller was asked about Blinken's primary objectives for the trip.
Secretary Blinken will travel to Israel and Jordan on Friday. The Secretary will meet with Prime Minister Netanyahu and other leaders of the Israeli government to receive an update on their military objectives and their plans for meeting those objectives. He will reiterate U.S. support for Israel's right to defend itself in accordance with international humanitarian law and discuss the need to take all precautions to minimize civilian casualties, as well as our work to deliver humanitarian assistance.
Asked if Blinken would visit Turkey this time, Miller said the only 2 confirmed stops were Israel and Jordan. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has joined other countries in the Middle East in condemning Israel for its strikes on Gaza. Erdogan spoke at a massive pro-Palestinian protest Saturday in Istanbul, saying Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is a terrorist, but the militant group Hamas is not. The United States and some other Western countries have designated Hamas a terrorist group. Retired U.S. Army Colonel Rich Outzen of the Atlantic Council told VOA the Biden administration has been careful not to provoke America's strategic NATO ally in Ankara, but has also not been eager to embrace Erdogan.
There is a disinclination to be associated with Erdogan and with his team. So pictures of high-level meetings between the two, or this, a secretary-level visit, if Secretary Blinken goes, or presidential phone calls. These are all things that the Biden administration has very carefully metered out.
International concerns are mounting over Palestinian civilian casualties. Outzen said Blinken will do what the U.S. has historically done in similar situations in the past: support Israel, but urge it to wrap up its security operations in Gaza as quickly as possible to minimize civilian deaths.
So I think that Blinken's main regional goal will be to ensure that everyone is ready to exercise diplomatic and, if necessary, military deterrent measures to keep Lebanese Hezbollah, the Syrians, or any other actor, the Iranians directly, the forces in Yemen, the Houthis that are aligned with Iran, from escalating this into a regional conflict.
Iran's foreign minister visited his counterpart in Turkey on Wednesday, and the 2 top diplomats said they shared concerns about the possible spread of the Israel-Hamas war to Syria and the rest of the Middle East. Turkey is pushing for an immediate ceasefire, which Israel has rejected. Cindy Sain, VOA News.
President Joe Biden is facing a revolt from members of his Democratic Party over his unwavering support for Israel as it expands its ground operations in Gaza and Palestinian civilian casualties mount. White House Bureau Chief Patsy Widakuswara has this report.
As Israeli airstrikes continue in Gaza, including this one on the Al-Shati refugee camp, an open letter to President Joe Biden from advocacy group the National Muslim Democratic Council, demanding that he broker a ceasefire by 5 p.m. Tuesday or face the consequence of millions of American Muslims withholding their support for his re-election next year.
We know for a fact that our community will make a difference in the battleground states. And I think Democratic Party leaders are paying attention, and they are afraid of what's happening. And they're sending messages to the White House that this is going to hurt our chances in 2024.
More than 1 million Muslim voters cast a ballot in the 2020 election, turning out in numbers large enough to potentially swing the presidential race in some battleground states. Muslim and Arab Americans traditionally vote for Democratic candidates, but a shift may be coming. A new poll by the Arab American Institute showed support for Biden dropped among Arab American voters from 59% in the 2020 election to 17% ahead of 2024.
We're going to continue engaging with the Muslim community, the Arab American community, and Palestinian American leaders to hear their concerns.
In contrast, Jewish Americans are deeply appreciative of Biden's support of Israel.
Israel is an important issue, remains a very important issue to Jewish voters. It's an issue about which there's a very high emotional attachment between Jewish Americans and support of Israel.
About 7 million Jews live in the U.S., the same number as in Israel. They make up 3% of the U.S. electorate. Biden is also widely praised in Israel. He has been urging Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to conduct the war following international humanitarian law to protect civilians.
What he's saying to Israel, to help me, to help you. If you give maximum effort to fight in the right way, according to the laws of war, then it makes it easier for me to support you and get support from you in the international community and at home in America and in the Democratic Party.
Polls show more Republicans than Democrats approve of Biden's decision to send weapons to Israel.
I do think that there isn't a lot of room for Republicans here, whether it's Trump or the Republicans in Congress, to outflank Biden on support for Israel.
Meanwhile, there's growing pressure for a ceasefire, including from anti-war protesters during Tuesday's congressional hearing. Administration officials have advocated for humanitarian pauses to allow aid to reach civilians, but say a ceasefire at this point will only benefit Hamas. Patsy Widakuswara, VOA News, Washington.
VOA's Jessica Stone is still with us live from the White House. Jessica, this war, to say it mildly, has divided public sentiment around the world, and we see those divisions particularly wide here in the United States, notably on American college campuses. Can you talk about that for us? What is going on?
Yeah, and I'm sure it's something you're watching very closely there in New York City, because a lot of it's taking place in New York City college campuses, Cornell, NYU, Columbia. In Cornell University, for example, they have canceled classes for today after one of their students was arrested on charges that he posted public messages on a student message board threatening to kill Jewish students with an assault rifle. And so on college campuses, a dearly held value is free speech, and this is sorely being tested by the debate over the Israel-Hamas war. There are pro-Palestinian protests, and there are Jewish students who are also advocating for themselves. Earlier this week, we also saw two Jewish students at Tulane University in Louisiana be injured, allegedly by pro-Palestinian protesters. And at Vanderbilt University in Tennessee, the Muslim Student Association has called on the administration to denounce the harassment of women wearing hijabs on campus. And this comes after initial statements made by Harvard University student groups in which they held Israel for responsible, entirely, quote, entirely responsible for the unfolding violence. That set off a string of reactions across the country, including former Harvard President Lawrence Summers, as well as people in Congress condemning that action. But Harvard President Claudine Gay has not punished the students in any way. She says they are entitled to their right to free speech, but that they do not represent the entire student body. One slogan we've heard repeatedly around the country, and I suspect around the world, is this slogan, "From the river to the sea, Palestine should be free." And this is really driving some of the offenses around free speech and how far it should go on college campuses. Some say the phrase is an expression of equal voting rights for Palestinians and for Israelis from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, but others say that this is actually a call to erase Israel and all Jews from the river to the sea. Certainly now that the conflict is widening, there is great concern across the United States on both sides of the debate that this will just get more pointed, more acute, that the protests on college campuses will definitely be more frequent. Susan?
Yeah, it's so disturbing to watch, notably the anti-Semitism. And as you mentioned, the other side is also facing a lot of issues when it comes to these protests. We just learned that hundreds of Columbia professors now signed a new counter letter, appalled and horrified at a letter that some other professors were signing regarding support for Hamas. So it's not just students. We're now seeing that the faculty is also getting involved. So the FBI is now warning that the Hamas attacks on Israel could motivate threats of similar attacks on the U.S. homeland. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, he said that these attacks are already, or the threats of these attacks have certainly been on the rise. And he says Iran, Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS, all of them in many ways believed to be backed by Iran, have all called for action across Americans and American military forces across the globe. He called on Americans during congressional testimony this week to be vigilant, especially American Jews. And he says even before October 7th, Jewish Americans were the targets, he says, of 60% of religiously motivated hate crimes. They make up just 2.4% of the American population. Meantime, the Council on American Islamic Relations reports that their complaints and desires, requests for help from Muslim Americans have risen by 182%. Ray says the war in the Middle East has really taken the threat level across the United States to the next level. And he says the FBI is worried about violent extremists, not so much large groups, but individuals, lone warriors, lone wolf attacks by smaller groups that could be inspired by the Hamas attack. And yet in written testimony, he also clarified that there is no reason to believe that Hamas itself can or will attack inside the United States.
Yeah, and we know Christopher Wray, FBI director, is not one to really exaggerate. So when he says something like this, then it's really a cause for concern.
True.
Jessica, thank you so much for all of those insights, and have a good weekend. Happy Friday. Thanks.